Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome to my messy kitchen. And we are currently in the middle of the COVID-19 stay-at-home quarantine. And 99.9% of Americans have decided they are going to cope with that by baking sourdough bread. So a week ago, I uploaded a video on my super simple technique for making sourdough bread, which basically involves 5 minutes of effort on the first day and then 10 minutes of effort on bake day. And the remaining 17 or so people in America who said, oh, sourdough bread's probably too hard for me, I'm not going to do it. They watched the video and said, oh, well, if it's that easy to make sourdough bread, I'd like to try my hand at making sourdough. How do I get a starter? So in today's video, I am going to walk you through the process of making sourdough starter from scratch to show you how simple it is. But be prepared because this process can take about a week, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on what type of flour you start with. And since flour is hard to come by during the quarantine, you go to the supermarket, you're lucky you see any of it, I'm going to demonstrate today with a variety of different flours to prove to you that really any flour can be used to make a sourdough starter. But the best flour to start with is an organic, whole grain wheat or rye flour. Now, if you are the kind of person that's like, quick, just give me the shortcut and skip to the end, get the hell off my YouTube channel! Other people make videos like that, not me. I am the ultimate food geek and I was put on earth to explain to you in clear English the scientific processes that happen behind cooking. So that even if you already have a sourdough starter, this knowledge can kind of empower you with all sorts of wonderful buzzwords to impress your family and friends with. But we want you to have a confidence behind the understanding of sourdough starter and baking sourdough bread, so that over the years of your life, as you interact with your starter and your bread loaf, you will cook with confidence and understand what's happening and how to deal with potential problems should they arise. And your sourdough starter is going to last as long as you take care of it, which can be the rest of your life and even passing it on to your kids. But don't worry, a sourdough starter really isn't as difficult to maintain as a lot of people think it is. It really only needs a feeding every month or two at bare minimum. All right, the first question is, why is the fastest route to a healthy sourdough starter via organic whole grain flour? Now, I know for a lot of people, the terms organic and whole grain are just hippie buzzwords. But for us, to understand this process, we need first a basic anatomy class on the seed. Because flour is just ground up seeds of a cereal grain like wheat or barley or rye. Now, on the outer part of our seed here, we have what's called the bran or the pericarp. And it's hard and mean, and its job is to protect that seed until it's time to germinate. Now, down here we have what's called the germ, and that is the itty bitty tiny little plant waiting in dormancy for that seed to get wet. And when that seed gets wet, the endosperm here on the inside, which is packed full, it's like a pantry filled with complex carbohydrates. These bacteria and enzymes that naturally occur inside that endosperm, they go to work breaking down that pantry of complex carbohydrates, turning it into simple sugars, which feed the little germ in the first few weeks of its growing as a plant. Now, the outside of this seed is also bathed in a very complex cocktail of yeasts and bacteria. And they are just waiting and hoping that they're going to get their hands on some of those simple sugars as they break down. And this is the natural process that we exploit to produce bread. Now, the primary yeast found on wild grains is called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Now, this is a really common strain of yeast that's responsible for many types of fermentation, not only bread baking, it's used to produce wine and beer as well. Now, store-bought yeast is a highly selected and improved strain of this wild Saccharomyces cerevisiae that can turn water and flour into a loaf of bread in 2 hours or less. But the wild strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae aren't quite as robust. They don't work that fast, and we don't want them to, because the slower a flour starches are digested by yeast, the more flavor the bread will have. Baking a good loaf of sourdough bread takes really a minimum of 24 hours and can go as long as 3 or 4 days, depending on how you treat it. The longer we take to get that loaf fermented, the more flavor it will have. But Saccharomyces cerevisiae is not the only wild yeast that's hanging out on the outside of the seed. We have a number of different strains. We also find Saccharomyces exiguus. We've got Candida tropicalis, Candida miliaria. There's also a strain called Hensula anomala. The yeasts vary by region, by growing environment, the climate that year, and whether or not the field is sprayed with fungicide, which kills yeast because yeast are a fungus. An organic grain will not have had its fields sprayed with broad-spectrum fungicide, which is why organic flowers have exponentially more wild yeast in each bag than flowers that were not raised organically. Now, yeast aren't the only thing hanging out on grains. There's also tons of wild bacteria strains. Now, there are several genera of bacteria that are commonly found on grains, but the one we hear about most often is called Lactobacillus. Now, this genera of yeast has about 200 different strains, and within those strains, there are dozens and dozens of different subspecies. So really, we are talking about a variety of thousands of different types of Lactobacillus that vary dramatically by region. In fact, your own kitchen has its own unique fingerprint of Lactobacillus bacteria that's different from anybody else's in the world. So even if you buy your starter online and it comes from San Francisco, the most famous sourdough destination in the world, or from Egypt, or whether you begin your own starter or borrow some starter from a friend or from a local bakery across town, or somebody mails it to you from the other side of the country, your starter eventually is going to take on the unique characteristics of the strains of Lactobacillus that live in your kitchen and on your hands. So your starter will be like nobody else's. But there are many other genera of wild bacteria that live on these grains as they're growing in the field, as long as that field isn't sprayed too heavily with microbicides for conventional agriculture, which doesn't happen with organic. We've also got a genera called leuconostoc bacteria, and they're very important. We're going to talk about them in detail in a second, because leuconostoc bacteria are an important part of your sourdough starter, but if you get too much of them early on in the process, it can cause problems. We also find Pediococcus and Enterococcus and Streptococcus bacteria, and there are some members of the Streptococcus genera that actually are responsible for strep throat, but you don't have to worry about those with sourdough. We also find Lactococcus bacteria and Vicella bacteria. Many different bacteria all play their role in producing the complexity in a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread. Now, we need to talk about processing, because how the seed is crushed and turned into flour determines exactly how much wild yeast is going to remain in that bag of flour after it's been processed. Now, whole grain flours like this organic whole grain rye and this conventional whole wheat flour are the entire grain of the seed, just crushed and ground up, bran, endosperm, germ, and all. So naturally, whole grain flours are going to include a lot more wild yeast, whether they're organic or not, because all of that yeast that was stuck to that bran is going to go into the flour and remain in the bag. But bran is sharp, and it can't be ground as finely as the endosperm. So those sharp bits of bran can cut through the strands of gluten that are developing in the bread. The gluten is what holds the carbon dioxide in that loaf. As it expands, that carbon dioxide creates an airy, open loaf. But if there's bran in there, it cuts through those strands, so the loaf cannot hold as much carbon dioxide, which is what causes the bread to rise. So breads made from whole grain flours tend to have a denser texture because there's less gluten development to hold in that carbon dioxide. On the flip side of that, whole grain flours tend to taste a lot better because they have a lot more flavor to them. So it's definitely a trade-off, and striking that perfect balance is an important part of learning how to make your favorite loaf. Now, the majority of flour produced is white flour, like these, unbleached or general all-purpose flour. And this means that the bran and the germ have been stripped away, and all you get is the endosperm of the seed. Now, the germ is rejected because it's full of these rich, heart-healthy, unsaturated and polyunsaturated oils, and these oils oxidize and go rancid very quickly, which means that whole wheat flours aren't very shelf-stable. You got to go through them pretty quickly, and if you don't, you really need to store them in the freezer away from oxygen as much as possible. But even white flour still has yeast in it, because as this bran gets stripped away, the yeast become airborne. They float around in the air, they stick to the milling machinery and eventually drop into the flour as it's being processed. So you still do find wild yeast even in white flours. Now there are two types of white flour, primarily speaking, bleached and unbleached. Now to be clear, all flour is bleached, even whole grain flour. But unbleached flour is allowed to bleach naturally by allowing the flour to age in contact with oxygen. Oxygen oxidizes that flour, makes it lighter in color and softer, which is the ultimate goal for baked products. But with bleached flour, they use a chemical process of bleaching which speeds up that process from seed to shelf. Unbleached flour costs more, even though they haven't used the chemicals in it, because they have to store it for longer, and storage time is money. With chemical bleaching, they use one of two different chemicals or a combination of both to speed up that process. First chemical that's commonly used is chlorine gas, right? Second common chemical is benzoyl peroxide. And if you had acne as a kid, that was the cream that you rubbed on your face. Yes, these are the two things that are used to bleach flour. Now, their intention is to radically and quickly oxidize and soften the flour with that chlorine or benzoyl peroxide. But there is a secondary impact that has on the flour that's not really intentional. Chlorine is put into your municipal water supply in order to reduce the number of microbes in it, right? Kills microbes. What are yeast and what are bacteria? Benzoyl peroxide that you rubbed on your face, its goal was to drastically reduce the amount of bacteria inside your pores. So benzoyl peroxide is also a microbicide. So any flour that has been chemically bleached has radically fewer wild yeast and bacteria in it because of that chemical bleaching process. Now, I'm certainly not saying that you cannot make a sourdough starter from bleached flour. You can, and I've done it. It just takes a little bit longer to coax what few wild yeast and bacteria are still in this flour into a healthy and robust colony of billions of yeast and bacteria. And before we reach that state where that sourdough starter can defend itself from invasion by other molds and bacteria that we don't want, it is vulnerable. So the shorter amount of time that we take until our colony is robust, the better. To summarize, the best flour to use is organic whole grain flour, either rye or wheat. After that comes regular non-organic whole grain flour. Next, we've got organic unbleached flour. After that, regular unbleached flour. And at the very bottom, we have the bleached all-purpose flour. Now, keep in mind, we're actually only talking about the flour that we're going to use to begin our sourdough starter, and you're only going to need about a cup of it. When it comes to baking the actual loaf of sourdough bread, these designations become a lot less important, and you can truly bake a spectacular loaf of sourdough bread using bleached all-purpose flour, because at that point, all you're doing is feeding your starter, giving carbohydrates and simple sugars to your yeast and bacteria. Time for another brilliant drawing by yours truly. Now, when you feed carbohydrates or simple sugars to yeast, that yeast gobbles it up and produces two basic byproducts. The first is carbon dioxide, and that's a gas. And those little bubbles of carbon dioxide gas get trapped by the gluten structure in the bread. And then when we heat the bread, those carbon dioxide bubbles expand, and that's what makes our bread rise and have a beautiful open texture. Now, back in the day, people thought that bread rose by divine work of the gods because they didn't know what yeast was. Now, the other byproduct here is ethyl alcohol, otherwise known as booze or ethanol, right? And these same yeast strains that are in our sourdough starter are used to make wine and beer, which you can then distill or purify into vodka, bourbon, brandy, tequila, and all the other wonderful shit that I love to drink. But in sourdough, we also have bacteria at play, actually way more bacteria than yeast. The bacteria outnumber the yeast by like 10,000 to 1. There's way more bacteria. And the bacteria actually feast on this ethyl alcohol that the yeast are producing, and they turn that ethyl alcohol into two primary byproducts. The first is lactic acid. That's the same acid that builds up in your muscles after you work out and makes you sore. They also convert that ethyl alcohol into acetic acid, otherwise known as vinegar. And these acids lend a tart, sour flavor to the dough and the resulting bread, which is why it's called sourdough. So the yeast and bacteria are working together, and their byproducts, alcohol and acid, make the environment of a sourdough starter very unwelcome for invasion by bad players like other molds and wild yeast and bacteria that aren't particularly comfortable in this sourdough starter and do not contribute any good stuff to our final bread product. But until we have literally billions of these yeast cells and bacteria living in our sourdough starter, it is vulnerable to invasion by those bad guys. So ideally, we want to build up this population as quickly in as few days as possible. And theoretically, the flours on this end of the spectrum do that significantly more quickly than the flours on this end of the spectrum. Now, there's one more tool in our arsenal that many sourdough starter recipes call for, and that is fruit juice, usually pineapple juice or orange juice or sometimes apple juice. And no, it's not because there are yeast and bacteria in the juice. Virtually all commercial juices are pasteurized within an inch of their life, so there's nothing living inside this can. But what the juice contributes is acidity early on before the bacterial colonies are producing their own natural acids. And that helps us protect the starter from invasion by bad bacteria, as well as helping us control an early bloom of an important bacteria called leuconostoc. Now, leuconostoc bacteria are good. We want them in our starter. They are an important part of many fermentations in the production of sauerkraut and kimchi, kombucha, even cheeses and yogurts rely on leuconostoc bacteria. But in the early days of the starter's fermentation process, the leuconostoc bacteria can actually kind of run wild, and they can turn that starter into a frothy, bubbly starter that might deceive you into believing your starter is healthy and on track. But as leuconostoc bacteria are wildly proliferating, their waste products can actually strangle out the wild yeast and produce an inhospitable environment for them. So by the time the leuconostoc have run their course and start to die down, the yeast are not healthy at all, not happy, and then the starter can mold and turn bad. So, fruit juice is an important part of that early step. It's insurance, if you will. You certainly do not have to have it. If you find that your COVID-devastated supermarket does not have any natural fruit juices in stock, it is not required. It just gives us a little bit of extra insurance in those first few days. So today I'm going to demonstrate how to make a starter from each one of those 4 flours. But we're actually going to produce 8 starters because I'm doing one only with filtered water to prove that you don't have to have fruit juice in your starter. We're also going to do another set of 4 starters using fruit juice as some of the liquid in our starters to see, with concrete evidence, whether they do happen to go faster and have better protection in the early stages. Now, I'm not going to keep you here from all of these because that would just waste your time, but you're going to be doing this at home. So what I want you to do first of all is to weigh out 2 ounces of your chosen flour. Now that does mean you need a kitchen scale, and yes, you must have a kitchen scale. If you don't already have one, shame on you, order it now. I'm pretty sure that it's considered essential equipment. It's essential in my kitchen if I'm gonna feed anybody. So you tear out or zero out your scale and place your container on top. Now most people like to use a wide mouth glass quart jar. I just don't have 8 of those that I can spare right now, so I'm using these plastic containers. You also want to make sure that anything that's coming in contact with your starter ingredients is clean. You don't have to go crazy and try to sterilize everything with bleach, but you do want to make sure it's been recently washed, hasn't been sitting around collecting dust or anything like that. All right, so measure out 2 ounces of your selected flour, and if you are going with the filtered water version, you will zero your scale out and add 4 ounces of filtered water. Now, why filtered? Well, we talked earlier that municipal water supplies have chlorine or chloramines added to them to kill microbes. Now, plenty of people do begin sourdough starters with regular old tap water, but our goal is to get them happy and healthy quickly. Also, so you can start making bread more quickly, right? So we want to do everything we can to be kind to the starter, and adding chlorine water to the starter in the outset is not being very kind to the wild yeast and bacteria that are in our flour. So use filtered water. If you don't have a filter in your house and you don't have bottled water, simple. Leave your water out overnight, the chlorines will evaporate out of them, or you can bring the water to a hard boil for a couple of minutes on your stovetop. Just make sure it's cooled back to room temperature before you use it. Now, get that starter good and stirred up. And when you stir, I want you to stir pretty vigorously because that incorporates oxygen throughout this dough, or technically right now it's a batter because of our hydration rate. Oxygen is an important tool for yeast to be able to reproduce. When people make wine and beer, during the first 24 to 48 hours of that fermentation, they typically will pump oxygen through that young wine or beer because their goal at that point is not the conversion of sugar into alcohol. And our goal at this point is not the conversion of starches into carbon dioxide. Right now, our goal is to build up the yeast colony. So anything we can do benefits us with that, and the oxygen certainly helps. Also, leuconostoc bacteria are an anaerobic bacteria, which means they work best in an environment that's deprived of oxygen. So by giving a lot of good vigorous stirring to this, we're incorporating lots of oxygen for our yeast to use to multiply and to hinder a buildup of leuconostoc bacteria. Now what you're going to do is set this starter on the countertop for the next day. And every couple or 3 hours when you walk by it and think of it, give it a good stir with a clean spoon. And note that I'm going to use separate spoons for each one of these so that I'm not cross-inoculating them, just to kind of add a little bit more credibility to this experiment. Now, if you're going to start with fruit juice, you'll weigh out 2 ounces of your selected flour. Then you're going to add 2 ounces of the fruit juice. And if you go 1/10 of an ounce above, that's not too big a deal. Precision is not an utter requirement in this particular phase. And then we're going to add 2 ounces of our filtered water. Now, this is a higher hydration than many sourdough starters call for. They will often ask you to just make sort of a dough using maybe 2 ounces of flour and 1 ounce of water, or a 100% hydration rate, which would be 2 ounces of flour and 2 ounces of liquid. I'm using double the amount of liquid, a 200% hydration rate, because that favors an acidic pH. And anything we can do, again, to help out our yeast in the early days, the better. An acidic environment will not hurt the yeast or the bacteria. They are accustomed to living in that environment and are happy living in it. So, we're going to start with pretty high hydration, and then we'll bring this down to a standard 100% hydration rate later on. I am going to finish these and then continue stirring them, and I'll see you tomorrow. Now give a little bit of thought to where you're going to store your starter during this process. Starter does prefer a window of 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, much above 80, and we start inviting in bad bacteria with an environment that's hospitable for them. Much below 70 degrees and everything starts to go to sleep and there's not very much multiplication of the bacteria and yeasts. So aim for a spot in your kitchen that's got a window between 72 and 78 degrees Fahrenheit. In my kitchen right now, because we're having a cold snap, that's right up there on top of my fridge. But in your kitchen in August, that might mean the back of a nice cool cupboard. It is day 2, and you should not expect to see anything noticeably different about your starters today, other than the fact that the liquid may have risen to the top, depending on what kind of flour you're using. That hasn't happened to our rye flour because it's ground more coarsely, and each individual grain of flour can absorb more water. In our finer ground flours, though, we do have a layer of liquid water that is separated to the top. That's not a bad thing, don't be alarmed. That's even going to be something you'll encounter with your own sourdough starter if it's been in the fridge without a feeding for a month or longer. That water does tend to separate to the top. Don't ever pour off water from the top of a starter. It is integral to the hydration balance of your starter. So if you do see water that is collected on top, just stir it back in. Don't be alarmed by that. Now, I am going to begin the laborious process of stirring all 8 of these starters with separate spoons. Your job today, no feeding, just continue to stir every 3 or 4 hours, if you think of it, to incorporate some oxygen into our starters and help this initial baby colony of yeast and bacteria to begin to take bloom. We'll give it a feeding tomorrow. Day 3, and something is going on inside every single one of these starters. We actually have quite a lot of activity. If you'll take a look here at the rye starter, only with filtered water, it is going absolutely crazy. We've got large bubbles inside the matrix. It's super, super foamy and bubbly on top. And if this was your first sourdough starter, you would be really excited about that. But let's contrast that to the starter that included the pineapple juice, which is going to help us control an early bloom of leukonostoc bacteria. Not nearly as much activity that's noticeable in this particular starter. There still are bubbles interspersed within the matrix. It's a little bit hard to see when you're zoomed in like this. And then if we look at the top, we can see some bubbles on the top. So very interesting stuff going on there. Taking a look at our whole wheat flour and filtered water starter, a very interesting phenomenon has occurred. We have a sort of three-layer separation with a denser layer of starter at the bottom, followed by a center layer of water that is filtered out, and then a really foamy, highly active layer floating on top of that water. In fact, this exact same phenomenon is also happening with our organic unbleached and our bleached all-purpose flour. I'm not exactly sure how to explain this, but I do know from my past of brewing beer that some yeasts prefer to ferment at the top of the matrix. Ale yeasts, which produce the vast majority of craft beer made in the US, ferment at the top of the matrix, while lager yeasts, which are used to produce the light beers that are the mass-produced commercial beers, they like to ferment at the bottom of the matrix. So it's possible there's something going on here related to that, but my hint is that we're seeing this activity from bacteria rather than yeast, because none of this activity is visible in the starters that include the pineapple juice. And pineapple juice is there to increase acidity and control an early bloom of leukonostoc bacteria. So that's my theory. We can see here in the whole wheat starter with pineapple juice, we definitely have some bubbles on top, and definitely some scattered throughout the matrix itself. Definitely activity going on there with the pineapple juice. Looking here at our organic unbleached flour, same foamy layer on top, though not quite as active as the whole wheat and rye flours. And looking at the starter made with juice, absolutely we do have air bubble activity within the matrix at the bottom, and we have some liquid that's settled out on top, which we already know is absolutely no big deal. And with our bleached all-purpose flour, same similar foamy layer on top for our filtered water, and on our pineapple juice starter, definitely plenty of bubbles trapped within that matrix at the bottom. Today we're going to do our first feeding, and we are going to be feeding 1 ounce of the original flour that you used to begin your starter. No water feeding today, because remember, our starters are at 200% hydration. We started with 2 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of water. So today we're going to add just 1 ounce of flour, bringing that hydration rate to 150%, stir it in really good, and then every 3 or 4 hours when you think of it, give it another good stir to incorporate oxygen to help keep that leukonostoc bacteria under control and give the air those yeasts need to breathe and reproduce. See you tomorrow. Day 4, and as you can see, that boisterous leukonostoc activity that was happening yesterday has subsided. That's good. Hopefully our stirring incorporated enough oxygen to keep those under control, and we hope that as their activity subsides, they have not created so many waste byproducts in the starter that our yeast have difficulty flourishing. That is our goal now over the next 48 hours, is to really build up that colony of wild yeast. Let's take a look here at the rye starter. As you can see, we definitely have a lot of really nice carbon dioxide activity from the yeast trapped inside that matrix. Not quite as much here with our whole wheat starter, though there is a modest amount of carbon dioxide bubbles trapped. Here in our organic all-purpose flour, again, few bubbles here and there, a little bit of water has risen to the top, and same thing over here for our bleached all-purpose flour starter. But let's take a look at our pineapple juice starters. This rye starter is absolutely, it couldn't look any better on day 4 than it looks right now. And this is why organic whole grain rye flour and pineapple juice is sort of the gold standard starter recipe, because it gets you where you want to go as quickly as possible. Let's take a look here at the whole wheat starter. Not quite as many carbon dioxide bubbles trapped, but it certainly looks better than the filtered water version. Here with our organic unbleached flour, we actually have some pretty decent activity. There is quite a fair amount of carbon dioxide bubble trapped in that starter matrix there. And over here for our bleached all-purpose flour, Sort of a similar situation. We have some healthy carbon dioxide bubbles trapped in that matrix. So all of our pineapple juice starters show really solid signs of moving in the right direction in terms of building up our yeast colony. What we're going to do today is provide one additional feeding to bring our starters up to a 100% hydration rate. And that means we're going to give our starter 1 ounce of the original flour used to create it. That's going to bring us up to a total of 4 ounces of our original flour and 4 ounces of liquid in our starter. I'm going to go ahead and feed one of these just so that I can show you what we're going to do next. Neat little trick to sort of track our progress. I'm going to give a feeding here to my unbleached organic starter that's made only with filtered water. So I'm adding this 1 more ounce of that organic unbleached flour. I'm going to give it a nice stir. And now it's going to be at 100% hydration. Once you've gotten it stirred quite well, go ahead and scrape down the sides so that you can see what's going on. As long as you have clean hands, it's perfectly fine to rake the starter clear of the spoon. That actually helps inoculate the starter with the lactobacillus bacterial colonies that naturally live on your hands. It's a good thing for the starter, not a bad thing, as long as your hands are nice and clean. Now what we're going to do is take a Sharpie and mark a line where our starter is at. Now if you happen to be using a glass quart jar, you can just put a piece of masking tape or painter's tape down the side and put your marking there in case you don't want to mark up your jar. This is going to allow us to track how quickly our starter doubles in bulk as we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the rest of my starters. Keep stirring again every several hours when you think of it, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Day 5, and we are getting a noticeable rise out of several of our starters. Take a look here at the organic unbleached flour with water starter. We've got a little bit of a rise going out of this one. Over here, our organic whole grain rye flour with water mixture has also given us a fairly decent rise. But the winner of all of them, completely expectedly of course, is the rye flour that had pineapple juice incorporated in it. If I turn this starter around, you'll notice not only plenty of small pockets of carbon dioxide trapped in that matrix, but we've got some really big air pockets. That means those yeast are definitely churning out the carbon dioxide. So that's really good news. However, none of these starters is even close to being able to bake a loaf of bread yet. What we are looking for is our starter must be able to double its volume within 24 hours after a feeding. So today we are going to begin the feeding regimen that we will use to feed this starter every single time we have to feed it for the rest of its life, or until you kill it by not feeding it for 6 months or a year. This is the key, and you can memorize it because it's simple, but I want you to fully understand it. To feed your starter, you want to at least double its weight with equal parts of flour and water. I'm going to say that again. To feed your starter, you need to at least double its weight with equal parts flour and water. I happen to know that we've got approximately 8 ounces of starter here because we began with 4 ounces of water, 2 ounces of flour, then we fed 1 more ounce on day 3 and 1 more ounce on day 4 for a total of 4 ounces of flour, 4 ounces of water. Add those together, you get 8. We want to at least double. That means we need to feed this starter at least 8 ounces. Now, if we're trying to make a whole bunch of starter to feed to friends or bake 12 loaves of bread, we can double, triple, quadruple the amount of starter. We can feed it as much as we want to, as long as we feed it at least the same amount that it currently weighs with equal parts of flour and water. So if we've got 8 ounces of starter, I am going to feed it 4 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of water. Now you're going to notice today that I am switching to feeding my starter white flour. This is the organic unbleached flour that I get at Costco that I use for all of my baking. But it does not matter at this point what type of white flour you feed, whether it's organic or not, whether it's bleached or not, because all we're doing is feeding the starter. It's hungry. Now you'll notice a lot of people do like to keep whole grain starters. I am not a fan of that, and I'll tell you why. When you feed your starter, we're going to give it 4 ounces of flour today. 4 ounces of white flour means 4 ounces of pure endosperm. And the endosperm are those carbohydrates and simple and complex sugars that were inside the seed to feed the growing plant as it was young, right? 4 ounces of endosperm is 4 ounces of pure food. If we have 4 ounces of whole wheat flour, a significant portion of that flour is made up of the bran and the germ. And those were necessary in the beginning, especially that bran, because the bran contained the yeast. Well, we already have the yeast. Now we want to focus on feeding them so that they multiply, right? So why would we feed them something they can't eat? They can't eat the bran, and they can't really eat the germ. They want to eat the endosperm. That's why I am going to feed them exactly what they want to eat, which is carbohydrates, the kinds of things that they use to turn into carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol, right? So, I'm going to add 4 ounces of white flour, 4 ounces of filtered water, and give that a really good stir. Now from this point on, you no longer have to stir every 3 or 4 hours. You're welcome. At this point, we just need to find out how long it takes our starter to double itself in volume. And once it can do that in 24 hours after a feeding, we know that it's ready to bake bread with. Scrape down the sides so that you can see your starter through the container. Kind of level it out a little bit so that it's not super mounded up. And then give yourself a new line. Now we are about half full on our container, and if you used a quart jar, it'll be the same. We need to see how long it takes us for this starter to rise up almost to the top of the container. So leave it on your countertop and don't do anything else to it until it has doubled in volume. That may take 24 hours, and if so, you're ready to bake bread tomorrow. It's more likely going to take 2 days, 3 days, maybe 4 or even 5 days. And if that's the case, we're going to keep cutting it and feeding it until it doubles its volume in 24 hours. That is the goal. See you tomorrow.